congratulations to my honourable friend, the member for Norwich South, for securing this debate, and it's a real pleasure to follow the right honourable member opposite. For me, the most alarming aspect of the whole issue of the treatment of SMEs by the banking sector is the conspiracy of denial which has existed between banks and their professional advisers. And this has been reinforced by the very institutions which are supposed to regulate the financial sector. My constituent, Mr Kash Shabir, is at the very least a victim of grossly unethical practice, but much more likely criminal fraud at the hands of Lloyds Bank, the same bank behind the HBOS Reading fraud. His case is a lead case, having formed the backbone of a BIS Select Committee inquiry in March 2015, chaired by my honourable friend, and 2 Westminster Hall debates, which I led on the 16th of September 2015 and the 18th of April last year. When lending to Mr Shabir was no longer attractive to Lloyds after the financial crash, it reneged on that lending commitment and relying then on an alleged breach to loan-to-value covenant. That breach was then justified by a down valuation of his property portfolio worth in excess of £10 million. That valuation, provided by Alder King LLP, a firm of chartered surveyors, whose employees were embedded in Lloyds Bank and who were then rewarded with lucrative LPA work. The substantial evidence that I have considered over the last 3 years leads me to conclude that criminal acts have taken place, followed by a cover-up by the parties concerned. Senior management of Lloyds, Alder King and the Royal Institute for Chartered Surveyors have all refused to meet me together with Mr Shabir to discuss his case. None of them have the guts to sit in a room with me and my constituent and listen to his legitimate complaint. The approach taken by Lloyds primarily, but also by Alder King, has been to use the gross power imbalance that we've heard about that exists between SMEs and the big banks to bully and belittle SME victims to the point where at least one of them has taken his own life. The big banks hold all the power. They have an army of expensive lawyers. They obfuscate and delay, knowing that if they keep batting away these complaints and the concerns of their victims, those individuals eventually capitulate because they have no other choice. I'll give way.
Your most powerful speech. Both she and the honourable proposer referred to the HBOS Reading case, which I think was a guilty verdicts were delivered on the 30th of January. Does she share my concern? Does the honourable lady share my concern, the concern of some of my constituents who have been affected, that they still haven't settled with Lloyds Bank a year after those verdicts have been delivered, which goes to what the honourable lady is saying?
For his intervention, I absolutely agree with him. Statutory limitation periods are run down through deliberate delay by the banks. They know they hold all the financial cards in this situation because how can any of their victims afford to litigate to get proper redress when they've already lost their businesses, they've lost their homes as a consequence of the bank's actions? I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and that is absolutely correct, as in the case of the constituent that I mentioned earlier. £45,000 at least, and that has taken up all of her husband's firefighter pension to try and tackle this injustice that she's so undeservedly been the victim of.
That's a very powerful example from my honourable friend about that gross imbalance of power. Legal expenses insurance is extortionate and it's out of the question, so my constituent was quoted a premium in excess of £1 million insurance cover in order for him to litigate against Lloyds. These deliberate tactics by the banks to prevent their victims from getting redress stink. It absolutely stinks. And all the time this is happening, Lloyds senior executives present a public face claiming to know nothing of what has gone on. I have copies of letters written by members of this House in 2014 to the Lloyds Chief Executive, to the regulators, formally alerting them that if they did not already know, there were irregularities in that bank. Lloyds themselves have an internal report which they commissioned in September 2013, the HBOS and Project Lord Turnbull report, which highlights many acts of criminality, as well as confirming that the bank knew about the HBOS frauds as far back as 2008. But it's been maintained by both the chairman and the chief executive of Lloyds that they had no knowledge, but I'm afraid I do not believe those assertions to be accurate. It begs the question that if the bank had knowledge of the fraud in 2008 and those HBOS convictions took place in 2017, why did the bank pursue personal guarantees on those fraud victims for 9 years until the case went to trial? There can only be two answers to that question, Either the bank is entirely incompetent or those running it have not been honest. I am calling today on the Lloyds Chair and the Board to publish that report in its entirety. And following those HBOS convictions, those individuals who are serving a combined prison sentence of 48 years, why has there been a failure by Lloyds to compensate their victims? Similar practices have been shown to have been prevalent in the Bristol offices of Lloyds, but as yet no police force has carried out a proper forensic investigation. Anthony Stansfield, the Police and Crime Commissioner behind the successful HBOS convictions, is determined to see a full and proper investigation into Lloyds Bristol and has passed evidence to the Avon and Somerset Police. And so I'm calling today on the Chief Constable of Somerset and Avon Police to expedite an investigation. As the evidence of the abuse by the banks and the conspiracy with their advisers grows by the day, the banks cannot say at the highest level that they were unaware of what was happening and somehow insulated from the abuses that were taking place. The Chief Executive of Lloyds, Mr Osorio, has made many public statements. His one to the Evening Standard on the 17th of May last year is just one of them, saying that he was unaware of the victims' complaints before the Reading fraud trial. But I understand that the Turnbull report confirms both his knowledge and the Lloyds Board's knowledge of the HBOS criminality. And I also have a letter of the 22nd of May 2014 from the Right Honourable Member for Twickenham, from whom we heard earlier about correspondence when he was Secretary of State for Business, confirming that he met with Mr Osorio to discuss my constituent's case and that Mr Osorio had assured him, and I quote, he had looked into the case personally. So it appears that Mr Osorio is not as remote from these victims' cases as he claims. It's imperative that we should have a full inquiry into the action of Lloyds and the other banks we have heard about today, which should include consideration of the culpability of individuals. It should also compel full recompense to those who have been affected by the abuse, and that should be the subject of genuine, independent, third-party administration and not the charade which has developed around Lloyds' handling of the victims of the Reading HBOS abuse. And that's why I support the establishment of this independent tribunal system, and I support the motion before the House today.
William Bragg.
Very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker.